Hey there, in this lecture we're going to cover the part of chapter 16 that specifically talks about how the West was transformed, and in particular how the indigenous peoples, the American Indians, were affected by this growth in the West in the late 1800s. So let's go ahead and get started with it. Capitalism itself really takes over the West, and it entices people to move out West quite a bit. One of the things that kind of forges this idea was actually a lecture delivered by a historian of that time, a man named Frederick Jackson Turner. There's an image of him right here. And essentially in this argument, he basically says that American political democracy, everything had expanded out west. And he gets this because the 1890 census in the United States basically said that we had already settled coast to coast. Okay, he was really influential at the time. He drew on this long-standing notion that the West offered, economic opportunity and freedom to newcomers. But the reality was, there were farmers, gold rush miners, and immigrants that did find some economic opportunity. But the West wasn't this empty space, but rather it was inhabited by, indigenous peoples, Indians, who, had been dispossessed by the white settlers that came out west. So it didn't take into account the peoples that already existed there, okay? And the other thing that it doesn't take into account, that the West wasn't really a paradise that, people were imagining. So, his idea, notion, and lecture really adds on to this mythology of the West and romanticizing the West, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. But one of the things also that encourages westward settlement is the fact that the government gave subsidies to people to come out west. The federal government created a program called the Dawes Act, which I'll talk about in a little bit, which essentially caused Indian land to go up for sale. And also it gave money to, farmers, encouraged settlement, and gave money to companies and railroad companies to lay railroad tracks. So basically giving them funding in order to be able to go west. One of the ways that they do this is through something known as the Homestead Act in 1862, which is actually passed during the Civil War when the South wasn't there to do that. And so settlers acquired farmland through this Homestead Act. They bought more land from speculators and railroad companies than really public lands. But either way, this vast agricultural belt was really great for growing wheat and corn. And it went all the way from the middle border of the United States, Minnesota, the Dakotas, Kansas, Nebraska, even in Texas, and created a very diverse population. Also, one thing that adds to people wanting to move west is also this new kind of farming technology that comes out, like reapers and, barbed wire and combines that came as part of this. I mentioned this before, but the romanticization of the West was really a huge thing at this time. Decades after the Civil War was this golden age of cattle ranching and cowboys, which, side note, was really learned from the Spanish and later from the Mexicans. The vaqueros were really the original cowboys. But needless to say, there were railroad stations in Abilene and Dodge City and Wichita, Kansas. They became destinations of the very famous cattle drives, right? And the cowboys, interestingly enough, were not all white cowboys, which is the way that things were depicted, at least initially. There was really a very wide variety of different types of cowboys. About a third of them were Mexican, another third were black, and then another third were white. Interestingly enough, the Whitty actually had an exhibit that lasted for a while on the black cowboys, which was a really fascinating exhibit. I believe there was a researcher up in Austin that was doing the work on that. But, kind of fascinating. A lot of this comes, though, from just popular culture at the time. There were things like, Wild West shows, Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows. There were dime novels that were out that people would read and would romanticize it. And I put one of them over here, Deadwood Dick's Doom. Deadwood Dick was a series. It was, they were called dime novels because, as you guessed it, it was a dime. And so this romanticizes this ideology of the West, but the reality is the life was really far from romantic. They were mostly low-paid workers, and it was very difficult. They slept on the land. It was extremely cold. Some of them died because of the conditions with that. And really, the cattle industry was not a bunch of usually small cowboys that were just out there trying to earn money. most of the cattle industry at that time was owned by very large scale ranches. Okay, another thing that's not really well known was the West was pretty urbanized at the time. It had large cities such as San Francisco and Los Angeles that, and later on due to oil, all throughout Texas, right? And large corporate enterprises dominated the West, particularly in industries like lumber. In East Texas, it was huge lumber, but there were large corporations that owned that. So it's kind of interesting the reality of the West and the way the West continues to be romanticized. And one thing that is obviously pretty upsetting was the subjugation of the Plains Indians in particular. So one thing to understand is that there had been a very active campaign to push Native Americans really since the late 1700s, and of course with Jackson's Indian Removal Act in 1830, to push them further and further out west to get them away from white settlement. But one of the groups that absolutely doesn't want to do this is the Plains Indians. The Plains Indians really couldn't acclimate to the white culture and the white ways of life because they depended completely on a nomadic lifestyle that followed the bison. Okay, so in the late 1800s, after the Civil War is over, the federal government really turns its attention to Native Americans, right? And the Native American problem, especially in Texas and in the western part of the United States. And so they actually had an active program that literally destroyed bison. They hired buffalo hunters to annihilate them, and that was really to really make the Plains Indians acquiesce and buckle and go on to on a reservation. I'm going to put an excerpt from a really passionate piece that was written by a Nez Perce chief by the name of Chief Joseph. And I want you to pause it right here and read it, and I'll put it just below this video. But it's a really fascinating piece that he wrote about how he felt about being pushed off his land and what the white man was doing to the American Indian. So I encourage you to go ahead and pause that. I also listed here some of the major Indian wars that are well known. Of course, the end of Custer at Crazy Horse, where he kills General Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn. The Sand Creek Massacre, the Battle of Wounded Knee, which is really the end of the Indian Wars, and which is where most of the Native American peoples really kind of gave up. There's another video just below here too on the Indian Wars that goes through the Sand Creek Massacre and others, the major ones in particular. So this would be a good time to pause that and listen to that as well. This is a really fascinating image. It kind of shows you how Native American lands have been lost over time. So I'm just going to go ahead and play it, and we can take a look at this and watch this. So we can see how, Native American peoples have lost their land really over time. In 1890, present-day Indian reservations. So let's watch that one more time here so you can see that. So this starts off, and you can see 1830 is the Indian Removal Act. 1890 is the Battle of Wounded Knee, so you can really see the loss of that land. Yeah, pretty sad. Another thing that was happening during this time period was the remaking of Indian life, right? To Americanize them, to assimilate them. Assimilation is a term that you definitely need to know. Assimilate means to make the same. And so this was done not just to indigenous peoples, but also to immigrants coming over, because culture at that time was, really not very respected. There was a saying that said, kill the Indian, save the man, which was actually, said during this time, that essentially said, get rid of their ways of life and turn them in kind of a white man, right? So they believed they were saving them by making them less, more civilized, more white civilized, anyway, at least the way that they saw that. So one of the things that they do was there was a Bureau of Indian Affairs that was created. And one of the things the Bureau of Indian Affairs does, amongst other things, they regulated the reservations as well, but they created Indian schools, right? And one of the most famous ones, we're going to see an image of the before and afters, was the Carlisle Indian School. And this was this way to, and here's this word again that's really important, to assimilate Native Americans. Another one was a well-intentioned act called the Dawes Act. And this goes about, like, this really tells you about the misunderstanding of Indian culture at all during this time. But they began to they took land from the reservations, they cut up the land, and they gave the individual plots to these individual families. And their idea was, oh, we're going to make them white by farming like a white person. Well, that's not the way that the Indians did farm, right? They farmed communally, they lived communally, and so most of them couldn't survive this, and most of them couldn't cultivate it. And by the way, it was really crappy land on top of that, okay? And another thing was that a lot of these the Indian peoples that they gave this land to in the Dawes Act were Plains Indians. You know, they didn't farm, and agriculture was not their way of life. So they really kind of set them up for failure. And this advertisement that's in here is basically, you know, the Indians were given the same amount of time that they were given in the Homestead Act, which was 5 years to cultivate. And of course, they were successful with that. Sadly enough, American Indians were the last to receive citizenship on the land they were originally on, sadly, 1924. Crazy. All right, so the last thing I want to show you is some of the before and after images of the Carlisle Indian School. And, you know, they forced to kind of assimilate them. So, yes, this is the same man before and after when he arrived at the Carlisle Indian School and after. Same group of people, same group of people down here. And this is like a basketball team. Anyway, so you can see that there was a real effort to do this. Again, they're going to do this with immigrants as well. Arguably, still that expectation is there today. Much more respected. We respect cultures much more today, but you know, not completely, and not in every cultural pocket of the United States. But I hope you found that a little bit interesting. I broke apart a couple myths that probably are out there, maybe probably still out there, right, about the West and romanization of that. And hopefully that helped you a little bit with content.